The message came in fragments, burned into the receiver before the receiver had been switched on. Dr. Elias Mast watched the printer cough up the warning 47 seconds before he keyed the command to print, and the paper was warm in his hands, and the words on it were written in his own handwriting, and the words said, "Do not send them, do not send them, for God's sake, do not send them in." He had not yet written anything. He had not yet been told there was anyone to send. Outside the observation window of Forward Station Kestrel, the star that the Foundation had named the Backwards Star pulsed once, slowly, in a color that no one on the station could agree on. And Elias Mast understood, with the patient horror of a man who had been understanding this for years without knowing it, that the work had already begun. Forward Station Kestrel was a ring of gray metal 300 kilometers across, tethered to a gravitational anomaly that the Foundation called the threshold. The threshold was not visible. It could be measured only by what happened to the things that crossed it. A probe sent across the line returned older than it had been launched, its serial numbers stamped in reverse, its onboard clock having recorded 8 hours of mission time in which the seconds counted down rather than up. A second probe, sent farther, returned partially. The parts that returned had never been manufactured. They bore the foundry stamp of a facility that would not be constructed for another 11 years. The Foundation had reviewed this evidence, considered its implications, and proceeded to do what the Foundation always did. It built a station. It hired physicists. It gave the project a name that sounded like a transit timetable. Project Retrograde. Beyond the threshold lay the star system that the records called the Omega System, and at its center burned the star itself, an object that ought not to have existed, because every law of thermodynamics that human beings had ever written down said that time, in this universe, flowed in one direction only. The backward star disagreed. Light traveled into it, not out of it. Hydrogen reassembled itself from helium in its core. The planets that orbited it spiraled outward year by year, gathering momentum, growing colder, becoming smoother and younger and more geologically simple, until they would one day return to the cold disk of dust from which they had condensed. Inside the Omega System, entropy ran the wrong way. The arrow of time pointed backwards, and pointed there absolutely, and no instrument and no theory the Foundation possessed could explain why. Elias Mast had been stationed at Kestrel for 6 years. He was 41 years old, narrow at the shoulders, gray at the temples earlier than his father had been, and he kept on his desk a photograph of a woman who had divorced him during the 3rd year of his posting because he had stopped being able to talk to her about what he did, and because what he did had begun to leak into the way he talked about everything else. He had begun, she said, to answer her questions before she finished asking them. He had begun to flinch at sounds that had not yet been made. She had not understood that he was not being cruel. He had been trying, very hard, to live entirely on this side of the threshold, and had been failing in small, invisible ways for years. He set the warning down on his desk. He looked at the date stamp on the paper. The date was 3 days from now. He looked at the timestamp. The time was 04:17, station time, which meant nothing out here, because station time was a fiction maintained for the comfort of the personnel, who needed to believe that mornings existed. He turned the paper over. On the back, in the same handwriting, was a single line. It read, "You already know what you are going to do." He folded the paper into quarters. He put it in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. He went to the briefing. The briefing was held in a circular room at the hub of the station, where the windows looked out only on the inside of the station ring, and not on the star, because Director Hessler had decided years ago that personnel performed better when they could not see the star while making decisions. Hessler was already there. So was Lieutenant Commander Aru Devet, the senior officer of the Foundation's small naval contingent. So were 2 researchers Mast did not recognize, both of them young, both of them holding tablets, both of them with the slightly stunned expression of people who had been briefed in transit and had not yet decided whether to believe what they had been told. "Elias," Hessler said. He was a heavy man with a permanently disappointed mouth. "Sit down. We have a development." "The Singh package," Mast said. He had not meant to say it. It had simply been the next thing. Hessler paused. The two new researchers looked at each other. Yes, Hessler said slowly. The SING package. How lucky guess. Hessler watched him for a long moment, then continued. The SING package, he explained, was a new piece of equipment developed by Site-41's theoretical division, a device that its designers claimed could, for a limited period, generate a localized region of forward-flowing time within a reverse entropic field, a bubble of normal physics inside the abnormal. The intention was to allow a crewed vessel to cross the threshold, descend toward the star, and conduct close observation of the Omega system without succumbing to the effects of reverse causality. The device had been tested in simulation. It had been tested on small biological samples. It had not been tested at scale. The Foundation, in its wisdom, had decided that the time for testing at scale had arrived. A vessel was already on approach. The Concordance, a modified Callaway-class observation cruiser with a crew of 9. It would dock at Kestrel within the day. After a final equipment check, it would depart, cross the threshold, activate the SING package, and proceed toward the star. The mission profile called for a 12-day round trip, station time. Why now? Mast asked. Because, Hessler said, of the signal. What signal? Hessler nodded to one of the young researchers who tapped her tablet, and a recording began to play through the briefing room speakers. It was a human voice, male, distorted with static and with something else, something that made the syllables seem to crawl backwards through themselves before settling into shape. The voice was screaming. Not in pain, in warning. The words were almost intelligible. Don't, the voice said. Don't send. Don't send us. We are all ready. We are all ready. There was a long burst of static and then a different sound, lower and slower. That was not a voice at all, but that made the human nervous system want to interpret it as one. And then the recording ended. This came in last week, Hessler said, through the threshold. The signature is consistent with a Foundation transmitter, although we have not been able to identify the specific unit. Command's analysis is that it originates from a future incursion into the Omega system. The reasoning is that someone has to go in for us to receive this. Therefore, someone will go in. Therefore, we are going to send them. Mast sat very still. You disagree, Hessler said. I think, Mast said, choosing the words with great care, that we don't know what we're receiving. I think a warning is a warning. I think there is no version of this in which the right response to a message saying don't send us is to send them. Command's position is that the signal proves the mission is survivable because someone has to be alive to transmit. Command's position is wrong. Noted, Hessler said in a tone that meant the conversation was over. You'll be primary liaison once they're underway. Get familiar with the crew manifest. They dock in 11 hours. Mast went back to his quarters. He took the folded paper out of his jacket pocket and put it inside the photograph frame on his desk, behind the picture of his ex-wife, where he would not have to look at it. He sat in his chair for a long time. He thought about the recording. He thought about the printer that had produced the warning before he had given it anything to print. He thought about how, when he had walked into the briefing room, he had known the name SING package before Hessler had spoken it, the way a person knows the name of a song an instant before the lyrics come back. The way you remember, the way you remember. He stood up suddenly and went to find Devet. The Concordance docked on schedule. Mast watched it through an exterior camera feed. A slim gray vessel with the angled prow of its class, its hull marked with the modular bulges of the SING apparatus, which had been bolted on at the last shipyard like an afterthought. The crew disembarked into the receiving bay. Mast went down to meet them. Their captain was a woman named Idra Solin, in her late 40s, with the calm gravity of a person who had been in command of difficult things for a long time. She shook his hand firmly. Her chief science officer was a man named Vanek, thin and pale and very young, who had written his doctoral thesis on temporal anomalies and who, Mast suspected, had spent the entire voyage out from Site-41, quietly terrified at the prospect of seeing his theories tested against the real thing. The medical officer was a woman named Ahmadi, brisk and competent. The pilot was a man named Bake. There were 5 others. Mast tried to remember their names. He found that he already knew some of them in a way that was not memory, but something else, something adjacent. He tried not to think about this. "You've read the brief?" Celine asked him. "I wrote part of it." "Then you know what I'm going to ask you." He did. She wanted his honest opinion of the Singh package. She wanted to know whether he, who had spent 6 years watching the threshold, believed the device would do what its designers claimed. He told her the truth. He told her that he did not know. He told her that no one knew, because the only way to know was to test it under the conditions for which it was designed, and the only way to test it was for someone to take it through. He told her that, if she wished to refuse the mission, he would back her formally and in writing, and that he had already informed Devitt of this intention. He told her that he believed the signal they had received was a warning, not a permission, and that he believed they should turn around. She listened to all of this without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, "Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate your candor. We're going in anyway." "I know," he said. "You know?" "I mean," he said, "I assumed." She studied him for a moment with the calm, steady eyes of a person who had noticed something and filed it away for later. Then she nodded and moved on, and the briefings continued, and Mast went back to his post, and 26 hours later the Concordance disengaged from Kestrel's docking ring, drifted out to a safe attitude, ignited its main engines, and began the slow burn that would carry it across the threshold. The first reports came back routine. The Singh package, Vanek reported, was functioning within nominal parameters. The local time bubble was holding. Subjective time aboard the Concordance was passing forward, second by second, even though the surrounding space had begun to behave in ways that the crew, watching through their view screens, described as deeply unpleasant. "The stars," Bake said, in one of the early transmissions, "the stars are wrong. They aren't moving the way they should be. They're getting brighter. The ones behind us are getting brighter, and the ones ahead are getting dimmer. I know that doesn't make sense. I am telling you what I am seeing." "It makes sense," Vanek said, his voice cutting in over the same channel. "Light is flowing backwards. The photons that we would normally be moving toward are moving away from us, and the ones we would be moving away from are arriving. We're seeing the past of the stars behind us and the future of the stars ahead. Or, no, the other way. I need to think about this." Mast, listening from Kestrel, made notes. He noticed that the transmissions were arriving with a small but consistent delay. This was expected. Light from across the threshold had to fight its way through a gradient of contradictory causality. What was less expected was that the responses he sent back, the routine acknowledgments and queries, were sometimes being answered before he sent them. He would type a question, and Vanek's reply would already be queued in the receiver, dated to a moment that had not yet arrived on Mast's chronometer. The reply would match the question precisely. Vanek, on board the Concordance, claimed to be receiving Mast's questions normally and answering them normally. The two of them were having a conversation that, from each end, seemed to be perfectly ordinary, and that, observed from outside, was happening in two different orders at once. By the third day, the situation had worsened. The crew began reporting what Celine called, in her log entries, the small wrongnesses. Amadi described the first one. She had been drinking coffee in the galley. She had set the cup down. The cup had been about 2/3 full, and the coffee had been lukewarm because she had been drinking it slowly. She had turned away to speak to someone. When she turned back, the cup had been knocked over. She had not knocked it over. No one had knocked it over. She had simply turned around to find the cup on its side and the coffee spreading in a brown puddle across the table. She had reached for a cloth, and then, she said, the coffee had moved. It had drawn itself back across the table in a slow, smooth contraction, as though the table were tilting, except the table was not tilting. It had gathered itself at the lip of the spilled cup and flowed upward into the cup, against gravity, and the cup had stood itself upright, and the coffee settling had begun to steam. The steam had risen for a long moment, then it had subsided. The coffee, when she had touched the side of the cup with the back of her hand, had been hot. Not warm. Hot. Hotter than freshly brewed. It had been, she said, the temperature of coffee that was about to be poured. "I am writing this down," she said in her log, because I want to be very clear about what I saw. The coffee was cold, and then it was hot. The cup was on its side, and then it was upright. I did not do these things. They were done. They were done backwards. Vanek tried to explain it. Inside the Singh bubble, he said time was flowing forward, but the bubble was not perfect. It was an approximation. Around its edges and sometimes deeper inside, the reverse flow of the outer universe was beginning to leak through. The galley table had been, for a moment, outside the bubble. The cup had spilled in the proper forward direction, in the local frame of the universe outside the ship, which meant, from the perspective of someone inside the ship, that it had unspilled. The coffee had been freshly poured in the forward frame, which meant, from inside the ship, that it had finished its life cold and progressed back to being hot. The events were not happening in reverse. They were happening forward. It was the crew who were running backwards through them. This explanation did not comfort anyone. The leaks became more frequent. Back reported that, on his way to the bridge, he had walked past a sealed bulkhead and seen through its small viewport an empty corridor. He had taken 3 steps further, then turned back because something had made him want to look again. The corridor, when he looked, contained a body. The body was his own. It was lying on its back with its eyes open. There was a wound in the side of its neck, a long ragged tear, and the blood from the wound was flowing back into the wound, and the wound was closing as he watched. And when it had closed entirely, the body sat up, stood up, and walked backwards down the corridor and out of sight. He had not yet, he reported, been to that corridor. He had not yet died there. He understood, in the way that a person understands something they have read in a book about themselves, that he was going to. He continued his shift. He reported to the bridge. He did not tell anyone what he had seen until he wrote it down in his log that night. Celine called a meeting. She had her senior officers gather in the wardroom. She read aloud from the logs. She asked, calmly, whether anyone else had experienced something similar. Every person in the room had. Vanek had cut his hand on a piece of equipment that had not yet been delivered to him, and the cut had healed before he had been cut, and then the equipment had arrived. Amadi had taken a pill for a headache she had not yet developed, and the headache had arrived 3 hours later, peaked and faded into wellness in reverse order. The chief engineer, a man named Bren, had received a message from his mother. His mother had been dead for 9 years. The message wished him good luck on his upcoming voyage and said that she was proud of him and that she was sorry she would not be there to see him return. It was dated the week of her death. "We knew this was possible," Celine said. "We were briefed on the possibility. It is happening. The question is what we do about it." "We turn around," Bren said immediately. "Vanek?" Vanek was very pale. "The Singh package," he said, "is functioning. The bubble is holding. These leaks are within projected tolerances. If we abort now, we will have come this far for nothing. Our mission profile gives us another 6 days. And if the leaks get worse, they might not. And if they do?" He did not answer. Celine looked around the table. She looked, last, at the small recording device in the center of the table, which was logging her words and her crew's words, and would, in due course, transmit them back across the threshold to Forward Station Kestrel, and to a man named Mast who would read them and understand things in an order she could not. "We continue," she said, "for now. Vanek, I want hourly checks on the Singh package. Amadi, full medical workups on everyone, twice a shift. Bren, you have my permission to abort if the engineering picture deteriorates beyond your judgment. Everyone else, write down everything. Everything you see. Everything you remember. Even if you don't think it makes sense. Especially then." The meeting ended. The crew went back to their stations. The Concordance continued toward the star. Mast on Kestrel was getting messages out of order. He had stopped trying to put them in sequence. He had begun instead to assemble 2 timelines, one as the messages arrived at his terminal, the other as their internal date stamps indicated they had been sent. The 2 timelines did not match. They diverged in ways that he could not entirely characterize. Some messages arrived hours after they had been sent. Some arrived hours before. One message, a brief routine status check from Vanek, had been arriving at his terminal once a day for 3 days straight, each time with a slightly different date stamp, each time apparently fresh. He had asked Vanek about this. Vanek had said that he had sent the message exactly once. Mast had stopped asking. He had also begun to dream. The dreams were not nightmares in any conventional sense. They were memories. They were memories of things he had not done, places he had not been, conversations he had not had. He dreamed of standing on the bridge of the Concordance and watching the backward star fill the view screen, larger and larger, until it was not a star anymore, but a thing that had a shape that the human eye could see, but the human mind could not retain. He dreamed of the thing turning toward him. He dreamed of the thing knowing him. He woke up sweating, with the taste of metal in his mouth, and he could not remember the shape of the thing, only that he had seen it and that it had been waiting for him, and that it was still waiting, and that it would always be waiting, because in the place where it lived there was no other tense. He took the folded paper out of the picture frame. He read it again. He already knew what he was going to do. He started writing letters. He wrote a letter to his ex-wife. He wrote a letter to his sister. He wrote a letter to Director Hessler, formally protesting the continuation of the retrograde mission and demanding immediate abort. He sent the letter. Hessler did not respond. Mast wrote the letter again more strongly. Hessler did not respond. Mast went to Hessler's office and found that Hessler was not there. He had not been there, his assistant said, for 2 days. He had gone to a meeting at Site 19. He had been called away suddenly. He would not be reachable until the meeting concluded. Mast understood. He went back to his post. On board the Concordance, on the 5th day, the crew began to age. Ahmadi noticed it first in the mirror. She was 43 years old. She had gray in her hair. She looked in the mirror one morning, and the gray was less. By the end of the shift, it was gone. By the next morning, the small lines around her eyes had softened. She measured herself. She drew blood. She tested her telomeres. She was, by every measurable indicator, 2 years younger than she had been a week ago. She was getting younger faster. The others were the same. Celine's hands, which had been stiff with arthritis for years, were limber. Bren's gut was flatter. Bake's eyesight, which had required correction since he was a child, no longer required it. Vanek, who was the youngest of them at 31, was the only one for whom the effect was not yet visible, because there was less in him to undo. "It's the bubble," Vanek said. He said it more often now. He said it the way a man recites a prayer he has stopped believing in. The bubble is degrading. We are aging in reverse because, in the local frame, we are running forward through a region where time runs backward. The Sing package is not holding. "How long?" Celine asked. "Until what?" "Until we're children. Until we're nothing." He did not know. He worked the equations and did not know. He requested the data from Kestrel. The data, when it came, arrived in the wrong order, and some of it was data from observations that had not yet been made, and one of the files contained an autopsy report on a man named Vanek, who had been found in the medical bay of the Concordance at an age of approximately 9 years old. He read the autopsy report. He understood that it was his own. He set the tablet down very carefully and walked out of his lab and did not return for the rest of the shift. It was at this point, on the 6th day, that the crew began to remember the future. It started with Bake. He came onto the bridge for his shift and said, in a perfectly calm voice, that he had remembered something. He had remembered, he said, the moment of his death. He had been on the bridge. He had been at his station. Something had come through the view screen. Not through it physically, through it. As if the view screen had been a door, and the thing had opened the door, and the thing had been on the other side. He had not seen the thing's shape clearly, because his eyes had stopped working, but he had known its shape, the way you know the shape of a word you cannot pronounce. The thing had taken him. He did not know what taken meant. He knew that it had happened. He knew that it was going to happen. He knew that he was, right now, remembering it. Celine relieved him of duty. She sent him to medical. By the time he arrived in medical, Ahmadi was remembering it too. By the end of the shift, every member of the crew except Vanek was remembering it, and they were remembering it consistently. They all remembered the same thing. They all remembered the thing at the center of the star. They all remembered that they had seen it. They all remembered that it had seen them. They remembered their deaths in detail. Bike remembered the way his blood had moved in the air around his body before it had fallen, because the air had stopped having weight. Amadi remembered the sound her own voice had made when she had screamed, except that it had not been a scream so much as a long, slow undoing of the years of her speech. Every word she had ever said played in reverse, pouring out of her mouth in a single, endless exhalation until there had been nothing left of her language and then nothing left of her. Soline remembered standing in front of the thing and not being afraid, because fear required futurity, and there had been no future in the room. They wrote these things down. They transmitted them. Masked, Kestrel received the transmissions and read them, and did not know what to do with them, because the transmissions were arriving before the events they described, and the events they described were memories of events that had not yet happened, and somewhere in the chain of causality there was a knot that could not be untied. He went to Hessler's office again. Hessler was back. Hessler looked, Mast thought, like a man who had aged 10 years in a week. "Pull them out," Mast said. "I can't." "Pull them out. You can. Send the abort. Their engines work. They can turn around. Pull them out." "Elias," Hessler said, "I sent the abort yesterday. They didn't acknowledge. Send it again." "I have sent it. I have sent it 9 times. They are not responding to abort commands. Their telemetry indicates that the SING package is offline. Their telemetry indicates that they are continuing to accelerate toward the star. We have lost the ability to direct them." "Then we have lost them." "Yes," Hessler said. "I think we have." Mast went back to his post. He sat at his terminal. He watched the messages come in. The messages were no longer in any order he could parse. Some of them were from crew members who had not yet been born. Some of them were from versions of the crew who had aborted and were on their way home. Some of them were from versions who had never launched at all. They all contradicted each other. They were all true. On the 7th day, the concordance reached the star. The transmissions from this period were the worst. They came through fragmented, screaming, layered over each other in dozens of voices, all of them belonging to the same 9 people. Mast could pick out Soline's voice, calm even now, narrating what she was seeing in the level professional tone of a woman doing her job until the end. He could pick out Vanek, weeping, repeating that he had been wrong about everything. He could pick out Bike, who was not speaking but was making a sound that was not language. And under all of them, woven through the transmission like a thread of something not entirely sound, was another voice, which Mast did not at first recognize, and which, when he recognized it, he wished he had not. The voice was his own. The voice was saying, "Do not send them, do not send them, for God's sake do not send them in." He understood then what the warning he had received on the first day had been. It had not been from his future self on Kestrel. It had been from his present self, recorded in the transmissions of the concordance, woven into them by the reverse flow of the star itself. His own warning bouncing back to him across the threshold from a future that was the past of the place it came from. He had been the one warning himself. He had been the one warning the Foundation. He had been the signal that prompted the mission that prompted the signal. He sat at his terminal and he watched the concordance burn. But it was not a burning. He understood that too gradually as the transmissions continued. The concordance had reached the star, and the star had taken it. But the star was not taking it now, in the sense that Mast understood now. The star had taken it always. The star existed in a region of space-time in which the verb tenses did not work. The crew, having been taken, were now beginning the slow journey back toward the threshold. They were, in their own subjective experience, fleeing the star. They were running. They had seen what they had seen, and they were running. But they were running through a region in which time flowed backwards, and every step they took away from the star, every kilometer they put between themselves and the thing they had encountered, carried them backwards through their own memories. They were forgetting. They were forgetting in reverse order, in the order that they had remembered, which meant they were forgetting the deepest things first and the most recent things last. They were forgetting the thing at the center of the star. They were forgetting that they had seen it. They were forgetting that they had been taken. They were forgetting that they had been afraid. Mast watched this happen across the transmissions. He watched Bike regain the use of language, the screams subsiding into words, the words becoming sentences, the sentences becoming calm reports. He watched Vanek stop weeping. He watched Celine's narration grow less detailed, then less urgent, then routine. He watched, over the course of a day, the crew of the Concordance become, again, a crew. They began to send normal transmissions. They began to discuss the mission. They began to talk about their families. They began, slowly, to grow older again, the years pouring back into them in reverse, the lines returning to their faces, the gray returning to their hair, the small accumulated wear of their lives gathering itself up again from where the star had unmade it. And as they came back across the system, as they approached the threshold, they began to talk about the mission ahead of them. The mission that, from their perspective, they had not yet begun. The mission they were about to launch on. They were excited. Vanek was hopeful about his theories. Celine was calm and ready. Bake was nervous but professional. Ahmadi was already planning the medical protocols she would need. They had forgotten everything. Mast understood, with the cold clarity of a man understanding the architecture of his own damnation, that they would arrive at the threshold ignorant. They would cross back into normal space. They would dock at Kestrel. They would disembark. They would not know what had happened to them, because from their perspective, nothing had happened to them yet. They would be the crew on the eve of their mission, fresh and untouched, and Mast would have to look them in the face, and he would have to brief them, and he would have to send them in, because the signal had already been received, because the warning had already prompted the mission, because the mission had to happen. Because if it did not happen, the warning would not exist, and if the warning did not exist, the mission would not be ordered, and the entire structure of cause and effect that had brought the Foundation to this moment would unravel. And Mast did not know what would happen if it unraveled, and he did not want to find out. He sat at his terminal. He watched the Concordance approach the threshold. He watched its transmissions become routine, then cheerful, then absent, as the ship slid back into the brief window before its mission began, the window in which it had not yet had anything to transmit. The transmissions stopped. The ship was, from its own perspective, about to depart. From Kestrel's perspective, it was about to arrive. It arrived 11 hours after the briefing. Mast went down to the receiving bay to meet them. They disembarked. They were the same people. They were exactly the same people. Celine shook his hand with the firm, calm grip of a captain in her prime. Vanek stood beside her, pale and young, his eyes bright with the prospect of the work ahead. Ahmadi nodded a brisk greeting. Bake smiled. Bren clapped him on the shoulder. They were healthy. They were whole. They were entirely, perfectly ignorant. "You've read the brief?" Celine asked him. "I wrote part of it." "Then you know what I'm going to ask you." He looked at her. He looked at all of them. He thought about the transmissions he had received. He thought about Ahmadi forgetting her own screams. He thought about Bike remembering his own death. He thought about Vanek weeping in a language that had been undone. He thought about the thing at the center of the star, which none of them now remembered, which all of them would meet again, which they had already met, which they would always be meeting. "You want to know," he said, "whether I think the Singh package will work." "Yes." He thought about lying. He thought about telling her that the package had been tested, that the device was safe, that the mission would succeed. He thought about telling her the truth, the whole truth, that he had received their transmissions, that he had watched them die, that he knew what they were sailing into. He thought about how, if he told her, she might believe him. She might refuse to launch. The mission might abort. And then the signal would not be sent. And then the Foundation would not have received the warning. And then the mission would not have been ordered. And then the Concordance would not have launched. And then there would be no signal. And the structure would unravel. He did not know what was on the other side of the unraveling. He did not know whether it would be better or worse. He did not know whether there was a version of events in which the crew of the Concordance had not died, in which the thing at the center of the star had not taken them, in which the long backwards flow of their memories had not pulled them clean of the knowledge of their own ending. He did not know. He told her the truth. He told her that he did not know whether the SING package would do what its designers claimed. He told her that no one knew. He told her that he had concerns about the mission profile, that he believed the signal they had received was a warning rather than a permission, and that he would back her formally and in writing if she chose to refuse. He told her that he had already informed Lieutenant Commander Devet of this intention. He told her these things because they were the things he had told her before, the things he had to tell her, the things that he understood now had always been part of the loop, the small permitted resistance that the structure of causality had budgeted for because it knew that he would offer it and that she would decline it, and that the mission would proceed regardless. She listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she said, "Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate your candor. We're going in anyway." "I know," he said. "You know?" He said, "I assumed." She studied him for a moment with the calm, steady eyes of a person who had noticed something and filed it away for later. He met her gaze. He held it. He wondered whether, somewhere deep in the part of her brain that had been undone and remade by the reverse flow of time, there was still some small residue of memory, some fading impression of the thing at the center of the star, the way a person sometimes wakes from a dream they cannot recall and feels all day that something is wrong. He wondered whether she felt that now. He wondered whether any of them did. She broke the gaze. She moved on. The briefings continued. Mast went back to his post. The Concordance launched 26 hours later. It disengaged from Kestrel's docking ring, drifted out to a safe attitude, ignited its main engines, and began the slow burn that would carry it across the threshold. Mast watched it on the exterior camera feed. He watched it cross. He watched it dwindle. His terminal printed a message. The message was warm in his hands. The handwriting was his own. The date stamp was 3 days from now. The message said, "Do not send them. Do not send them. For God's sake, do not send them in." He folded the paper into quarters. He put it in the inside pocket of his uniform jacket. He sat at his terminal. He waited for the transmissions to begin. In the years that followed, Project Retrograde was quietly mothballed. No formal report was ever filed regarding the fate of the Concordance. The vessel was officially listed as lost with all hands during a routine survey, the cause undetermined. The Foundation, in its wisdom, decided that some things were better left unknown, and that the backward star was one of them. Forward Station Kestrel was decommissioned. Its personnel were reassigned. Dr. Elias Mast accepted a transfer to Site 19, where he worked for the remainder of his career on matters unrelated to temporal anomalies, and where he was, by all accounts, a competent and unremarkable researcher who kept to himself. He kept, in his desk drawer, a folded piece of paper in his own handwriting. He never showed it to anyone. He never threw it away. On the nights when he could not sleep, which were most nights, he would take it out and look at it. He would read the warning, he would turn it over, he would read the line on the back. "You already know what you are going to do." He did. He always had. Somewhere, in a region of space that no Foundation vessel would ever again approach, a star burned in the wrong direction, and around it 9 people sailed forever inward and forever outward, meeting a thing that had always been waiting for them and forgetting it again as they fled, sending their warnings back across the threshold to a man who had already received them, who would always be receiving them, who would always be sending them on. The loop did not begin. The loop did not end. It simply was, the way the star was, the way the thing at the center of the star was, the way all of it had been from the moment the Foundation first measured the anomaly and named it and decided, in the way the Foundation always decided, to look closer. The printer in Elias Mast's quarters, long after Kestrel had been abandoned and the station's reactor shut down and its corridors left to the cold, would continue, on certain nights, to hum quietly to itself and produce, on its single remaining sheet of paper, the same warning in the same handwriting, over and over, addressed to no one, received by no one, written by a man who had long since died and who, in the place the message came from, had not yet been born. The paper would gather. It would drift in the zero gravity. It would settle, eventually, against the cold viewport that looked out toward the threshold, where the backward star burned quietly on, indifferent and eternal, sending its light in toward itself, eating its own future, remembering forward into a past that the universe had not yet finished writing. And the warning in the small dark room would read, in handwriting that no one was left to recognize, "Do not send them, do not send them. For God's sake, do not send them in."